Hey, so I'm going to walk you through how I paint this forest scene in gouache. So it gives you some good examples of how to really build up layers with gouache and start with a really light, watery layer and then build up to a creamier, thicker, more opaque layer as you go. So I'm looking at this painting and I see, it's kind of hard to see in the little photo, but I can see that there's a slight bluish cast to the fog and the mist in this forest. And that's obviously what I want to capture first. So I have a light blue color here. It's actually called, it's called sky blue, I think. I'm going to double check for you. It's called aqua blue. It's a color from Holbein. Most of my gouache it's either Holbein or Daniel Smith gouache. One of those two is usually what I use. So I wanted to go a slight bit bluer than what you see in the photo, but as I'm putting this down, it's a very watery wash. Already I'm thinking, maybe this is a little bit too blue, maybe I pushed this a little too far. I'm just seeing how I like it. One of the nice things about starting with a really light layer is you can always come in on top of it and change it a bit. But I'm just mixing in, I've got a light gray, I've got a white, I've got a little bit of this blue, and I've decided to turn it upside down and let that bluer part be at the bottom. So where there's sort of a thicker little bit of fog off in the distance and sort of this vague sense of more trees. But basically I'm doing a very light watery wash to get a color down, just to sort of take away the white of the illustration board. By the way, this is an illustration board from Crescent. It's sold as a watercolor board. It works great for gouache. I really like these because you can put this on the wall without framing it, unlike, something that's a piece of paper where you might want to frame it behind glass. These are sort of great because they're art panels and you can just pop them in a frame. So the first thing I want to do is put in some of these very ghostly, shadowy trees that are kind of off in the mist. And they're mostly bare trees, right? So all I need is a slightly darker version of this background color. And again, I'm pushing it a little more blue, so not quite so gray. I just like the sense of this bluish mist. And because the board is still wet, the branches are going to kind of spread out a little bit. There's going to be a little bit of feathering, and that's kind of on purpose. That's the way this photo actually looks. Like if you look back through the mist, you don't see really hard edges. Everything gets kind of blurry. So I'm taking advantage of the board still being wet to go ahead and let some of these tree shapes off in the distance be more blurry. So I'm putting in a few conifers that I can kind of just barely see back there, so that it's that, and then also just more of these bare tree branches. And I know that as this dries, some of this is really going to kind of it'll fade and it'll all blend in with this background because it's so close in color. So I want to sort of put more down than I think I need to because I want to really populate the background and just give it the sense of depth. So I'm using a pretty fine brush for these initial fine details. I really like these Princeton Velvet Touch round brushes. They're pretty great. I'm gonna tell you what I'm using here. Right now I've got a 4 long round Princeton Velvet Touch, and then in a little while you'll see me use a 10 long round. They're quite nice. And they really hold a nice point, which is great because you can get these little sharp details. I'm also going to be using in a little bit a script brush. Those are sometimes called liner brushes or rigger brushes. But we're not quite there yet. So now I want to mix a little bit of a bolder gray color. So I've got ultramarine and burnt sienna, and you mix those two together, you get a pretty beautiful gray. So that's perfect. And I'm mixing it in with the paint that was already there, which was a little bit of white and a little bit of just light gray. I just happen to have this tube of light gray that I needed for a workshop. Normally, it's very easy to mix that. You don't need to buy light gray out of a tube, but I had it, so I thought I might as well use it. So now my board is dry. So there's not going to be quite as much feathering of the branches. They're not going to look quite as blurry. It's like we're coming forward in the foreground a little bit. So you get to see a little bit more detail. And I'm just sort of, I'm kind of paying attention to what I see in the photo, but I don't need to copy it exactly. Already my painting is looking a little bit different from the picture, so I'm not trying to copy a picture. So I might as well, really make it my own and work on the drawing that's in front of me, work on the painting that's in front of me, not so much be fixated on copying the photograph. I'm also still staying pretty watery because it's still pretty far in the background. So here's that liner brush. So you can see you can get very, very fine branches because there are these really delicate branches on some of these trees. And I want that variety. I don't want everything to look exactly the same. So I'm really just kind of, keeping an eye on the photograph and keeping an eye on how I see these configurations of branches, the thicker ones, the thinner ones, but also just being mindful of, doing what works for the painting that's in front of me. And by the way, for a palette, I'm just using a white dinner plate. I pick these dishes up at thrift stores, and as long as there's enough of a flat area in the middle of the plate, it's actually pretty great as a palette, and it cleans up completely, so it doesn't stain at all. So I really recommend that. It's a very easy way to have a variety of different sizes of palettes that you can work from. And I try to sort of keep my warm and cool colors separate from each other, so you can see that I've got blues on one side and I have some yellows and browns on the other side. One of the things I really like about gouache is that even if this little bit of gouache that's down on the palette starts to get dried out, I can add water and re-wet it so that everything in my painting is mixed a little with everything else. All these colors are going to be mixed together, and so hopefully they'll feel pretty harmonious because of that. I want to try to use as few colors as possible so that it all blends really well. So now I'm starting to add some branches that are a little bit more in the foreground. So they're darker. My mixture is still kind of watery, which means it's going to mix a little bit with the layers that are underneath it, but not too terribly much. I mean, this layer is browner because it's closer to the viewer, so you can actually start to see some color a little bit. And it's not mixing too much with that blue that's underneath. So I'm just going to keep working this mixture. I'll bring in a little bit more brown from time to time, or a little bit more blue to just kind of push it in one direction or another, or to get it a little darker and a little thicker as I go as well. So the closer we get to the foreground, the thicker this paint's going to be, because I'm going to want to put it down in such a way that it's really thick and opaque, those last few layers. So you'll see that happening as well. So I'm just kind of experimenting with the colors I have on my palette, going back and forth, and bringing in some of these thicker tree shapes. And they're really kind of funny shapes. Like these are, these trees look like they've been through a lot. So I really want to get the kind of weirdness of the shapes of these trees. I don't want them to look like they, came out of a cartoon, right? I want them to look kind of real. Like they're a little scraggly, and that's okay. I'm going to bring a little bit of gray into this mixture. This mixture is getting a little bit richer now, a little bit thicker, not quite so watery. So the trick with gouache is kind of like, managing that water. You need enough water so that it lays down smoothly on the surface, but you don't want so much water that it's a super watery watercolor wash, unless that's like what you're doing as you get started. So you can see that, I'll come in and add a little more water if I want something that just flows a little bit better, but then there's going to be times when I'm going to want like just a really thick, rich mixture of paint to lay down. So I'm just working on these trees that are kind of more in the foreground, trying to let them be really irregular, let the trunks be different sizes and, and all of that. And I'm working between kind of a mixture that's a little more gray and a mixture that's a little more brown so that there's some variety. And also there's all these branches that are sort of coming down and dipping down into the foreground. And these are sort of important because they're the only branches that have any leaves left on them. And sort of the point of the painting is that, you know, it's like the last few leaves are still clinging to the tree right before the beginning of winter, like right at the end of fall. So I want to be sure and get all those, that little configuration of branches in because I know I'm going to be putting leaves on those in a bit. But really, this part of the process is just kind of, you know, it's kind of meditative, and it's just sort of a lot of going back and forth and thinking about how to kind of create this sort of layered scene without really overdoing it too much. So, and I can kind of go back and forth with the different values, like the lighter, more watery trees that are kind of a lighter gray, and the darker ones that are more in the foreground. I still have the option to do some of that. You know, I've left myself plenty of space, so I can continue to add and can continue to change these up. And one of the nice things about gouache is that because you can keep layering on top, you can sort of go over something and then realize later, like, oh, I covered up something I didn't mean to cover up, and you can put it back in. So I think it's important not to be too precious about, what you've already done. Don't be afraid to put something on top and then come in later and make little adjustments, little corrections. That's totally okay to do. So there's this sort of big tree that's in the foreground, and it's the darkest one, this one over to the far right. So I've got like a bolder mixture of the ultramarine and the burnt sienna. And I'm just looking at kind of these sort of strange wobbly branches coming off of here and just trying to get as much of that as I can. I think I will actually do a little bit more that is meant to feel kind of like background stuff. Like I feel like as it has dried, maybe I've lost a little bit of that sense of other trees in the background. And I think in the lower part of this painting, it's sort of helpful to have this feeling like there's more going on. It's sort of darker in the lower part and lighter as you go up top towards the sky. So there again, I can sort of just wash that in and then keep layering trees on top. It'll be fine. So now I do want to start thinking about some of these leaves. So I'm just going to mix some yellow ochre with some ultramarine to get a very muted dark green. So this is meant to be something like these leaves are, it's really the end of the season. They're not super vibrant. Nothing in this picture is very vibrant because there's like no sun getting in. Everything's very muted because of the fog. And I'm just using the tip of my brush and doing some really random shapes. I'm not trying to make these perfect little oval leaf shapes everywhere. I just want to create kind of a little bit of a messy foreground of this foliage. And that's all a very muted, kind of olivey, super dark green. But now I'm going to get a little bit of lemon yellow because I want, some of these leaves are actually a little bit lighter. So I will come in, let me just do a bit more with this dark green while I've kind of got it here. There are more leaves kind of up in some of the upper branches of these trees. And I can see also that there's this pattern of leaves here that I didn't really put a branch right there, but I can come back in later and connect those with a branch. So I'm just sort of noticing that there's that grouping of leaves right there that I want to include. And the other nice thing about gouache here is that like if these leaves blend a little bit with the color that's right below them, that's kind of great because we want everything to feel very neutral and dialed back and sort of unified. But this is a pretty dry mixture at this point. It's not very washy. It's pretty thick and creamy, and that's what I'm after. Dot in a few more of those. It's still a little bit wet near the bottom of the painting, so I may come back to that. So now I'm getting some ultramarine and mixing it with that lemon yellow. So now I get kind of a nice bright green, because there are, like in the foreground here, which is obviously the closer to the viewer, the more color you can see. So in the foreground, there are some kind of brighter leaves. So I do want to put some of that in because I think it sort of suggests this idea of like foreground and background, right? So I'm just going to add in a little bit more of this brighter green in with the darker greens, just suggesting some of those leaves. And there's a few up in the trees that I can see as well that are very light. Not too many. Drop a few in. And you can see right here where I lay it on top of the branch right there, or on top of the trunk of that tree. Like, that's the nice thing about gouache, is it is opaque. So I can put a light colored leaf in front of a dark colored tree, which is a lot harder to do with watercolor. Usually with watercolor, you have to reserve the space for your lights, but you don't have to do that so much with gouache. Let a few of those lighter colors come in. These are like leaves that are just sort of faded at the end of the year. They're not like new spring leaves, but I just want to suggest some of those. I don't want them to be super visible because really, like when you look at the photo, what you notice the most are the yellow leaves. So these green leaves are more like supporting characters. There's just a lot of like, moss on the trees and like stuff's been growing on them. So I like that feeling of just unevenness and texture. So I'm just going to go in and add some of that here and there so that you get the sense that they're not like perfectly smooth. There's sort of a lot going on. It's fun to do with a brush like this that has a really fine tip on it. You can get those kind of wonderful details. So that's very cool. So now I want to get into these orangey yellow colors. And so that's new gamboge. Gamboge is a beautiful orangey yellow that's really I use a lot. And it's great for kind of the effect of sunshine on things. So normally it's a very sunny color. But in this case, I'm going to use it for sort of these like orange leaves that really stand out against this misty, foggy background. And here I'm using basically undiluted paint. So this is about as thick and rich a mixture of gouache as you're going to get. My brush is a little bit damp, but I'm just taking paint straight out of the tube here. There's really no water. If I had added a bunch of water in here, then it would have mixed a lot more with the colors that are underneath. But if I just drop down a very thick layer, then I can put it right on top of those branches and the color will still stand out. And I can see that there's a few over here. So I'll have to draw in some branches to support those leaves in a minute, but I'll do that. That's not a problem. There's also some kind of browner leaves, like just dead brown leaves down here. Get a few of those in. Kind of knock it back a little bit and just, suggest that feeling of the end of the year. I'm also just using that brown up with some of these green leaves just to have everything be not quite so green. Like that's another cool thing. Like I can sort of go on top of some of it and just change it, mix it up, give it a little bit of variety. So that's a nice thing to be able to do. I think it's reading pretty well. A little bit more down there. So that's looking pretty good. I'm just going to clean off my brushes and then I'm going to come back in to this gray mixture. And again, this is what I like about, one of the things that's great about gouache, it's of course similar to watercolor, is that these colors are going to stay on my palette and they're not going to dry out the way they would with acrylic or acrylic gouache, which means I can keep using them. So I'm just dipping back in. I'm realizing that I want some of these branches to go all the way up to the top. These are very tall trees and we're only looking at part of them. So I don't know why I didn't send the branches all the way off the edge there, but I'm going to do that now. And I'm just kind of flicking my brush in a few other places to suggest more of those branches that are like behind everything. And so I can still kind of do that without really disturbing what I've already done. Because, this is very atmospheric. And so I can just kind of lay those in. And they still read. They still look pretty good. And this is that liner brush, that script brush. So super, super thin lines. I could also come in and do this with like a colored pencil or a pen or a marker. So that's another cool thing, is that you don't so much notice the difference if you bring in just a little bit of ink. If you do it just right, it looks like the gouache. You don't really see the difference. So sometimes I will come in with just a very fine pen or a very fine pencil for some of these details. But this script brush is terrific, and you can see you can get super, super delicate lines. Just looking for any other opportunities to put in those really fine branches. But this is really looking pretty good. I think it's coming together. Just cleaning off my brush again. So I've gone back to my bigger brush and I've gone back to that watery mixture because I feel like I can do a little bit more down here just in terms of these atmospheric, this idea of like these trees off in the distance. So I'm just going to keep adding to those. It doesn't really interfere too much with what I've done in the foreground. I mean, one thing I will say is that if you do little small versions of a painting first before you tackle a bigger one, then sometimes you sort of work out some of these questions and you realize like, oh yeah, I think I want a lot more happening in the background. And you'll sort of know that when you size up to a bigger size. So there's a great reason to do like a little tiny, maybe a 5x7 or even smaller, even the little like, I don't know, 3x4 sketch in a notebook, in a sketchbook first before you start on a canvas or a bigger version. You'll figure out your colors and you'll also just sort of figure out how you want to approach it, right? What do I want to do first? What do I want to do second? What do I need to remember for the background? What do I need to remember for the foreground? That can be a nice thing to do. I did not do that in this case, but that's sort of how you work out some of these questions about like how to handle the background, how to handle the foreground, those kind of things. So for sure, if I was going to do a larger version, this is 8x10, but if I was going to go bigger, it would really help that I had done this because this would tell me a lot about what I want to do next time. Like I would remember things, like make sure the branches are all going off the top of the image and think about how much you want to do in the background and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so we're really down to just finishing touches at this point, honestly. This is the kind of stuff where I will stand back. Sometimes I'll take a picture and just walk away from the painting and look at it on my phone, and immediately I see things I want to change every time I do that. So this is where I'm just coming in and seeing if there's anything else I want to touch up. One of the things about gouache, like I said earlier, is that when it dries, it can dry a little bit lighter. So sometimes sometimes you want to look at it and go, oh, I think maybe I can make this a little bit darker here and there. Or maybe I want to punch up the lights. So like now, I'm getting out some of that lemon yellow again, and I want just a few leaves right in the foreground that are a little bit brighter, which is, I think, true to the idea of fall. Some of these could be lighter. And I think just that tiny little bit, I really like what that does. I don't want to do too much. This is always the thing. I always get sort of carried away and end up adding a bit too much. But I think that's kind of like just the right amount. I think this looks pretty good. I'm going to make a little bit more of that kind of orangey dead leaf color. Maybe add a few more of those here and there. This is all really just like, at this point, it's all just like finishing touches. I'm really just sort of messing around, experimenting. Oftentimes, this is when I overwork it, when I'm doing these like last minute little, just looking for anything that I might want to change, anything I might want to add. I'm really looking to make sure that the darks are dark enough and that the lights are light enough. That's kind of that's kind of what it all boils down to in the end. So like here, I'm going to do a little bit more of these super fine dark branches. I can just see a few places where I think it would just sort of help with this sense of the foreground to just show these like very thin, elegant little branches coming down. Just a few that are bare, so that you can tell, you really get the sense of like these are really the last few leaves that are clinging on to this thing, and that's it. So I think this is looking pretty good. This is all really unnecessary, but if I wanted to do just a tiny bit more, I might just add a little bit more in terms of some of these branches, just a little bit more of darkening up the darks, making the lights a little brighter, that kind of thing. But this is pretty much it. So if you enjoyed this, please give it a like. You can subscribe to the channel. And also, I send out art lessons that go out every week to your inbox. And that's something you can subscribe to. So I'm going to put a link down in the notes if you want to check that out and sign up and get things sent to you every single week. But I hope that you will, have a little fun with gouache. I think the big takeaways here, try to limit the number of colors that you're working with, keep everything very unified. Start from the background, go to the foreground, start with really watery, wet washes, and then work your way up to thicker, more opaque areas towards the end. And do little sketches, have a lot of fun with it, and keep painting.